Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see such a filled cinema screening hall for such a beautiful film. My name is Hugo Emmerzael and I'm here to welcome you and to introduce you to the film of tonight, Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind. This is a summer with Ghibli, and I am here on behalf not only of KINO but also of the CinemAsia Film Festival that takes place every year in Amsterdam. And it's funny that I'm now introducing this film as my first, because this is actually not an official Studio Ghibli film. When Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind got released in 1984, Studio Ghibli was not yet formed in Tokyo, Japan. Studio Ghibli has grown to be, since 1985, the year that they established themselves as a studio, as one of the leading animation studios in the world. Next to Walt Disney and Pixar, which is actually fused together in the United States, Hollywood. This is one of the biggest animation studios in the world, and it's also one of the most critically and commercially heralded studios. Studio Ghibli films are involved with very heavy subject matter like environmentalism, religion, the relationship between nature and technology, the inevitable progress of society and the toll that it takes on the earth. These are not only timely subjects because they're usually stemming from specific moments in time and space, but they're also timeless because when we're watching a film like Nausicaä today, this film is from 1984, so we're like 34 years later, it's almost haunting how many of the issues that are at the center of this film can still be seen as issues in the center of contemporary society now. So these films are a pretty big deal, and then at the same time they are told in such an intimate and small way that they find this very affecting and arresting manner to address you, to kind of lure you into this beautiful world and then shock you and sadden you or overfill you with joy or all of those things at once. This is the nice thing about maybe not only animation from Japan but also maybe Japanese cinema and maybe some of the more the bigger works in Japanese literature, is that there's no black or white, no absolute good, no absolute bad, but there's only all these kind of complex shades of gray in the middle, and it's up to you to deal with that and to interpret it, and then also not necessarily pick a side, but then to just kind of negotiate what it is that this film tries to say you. In Nausicaä you will see the title character of the film. She's called Nausicaä and she's the princess of the Valley of the Wind, and this is one of the more peaceful tribes in this post-apocalyptic world. And her big foe, the villain in the film, is actually not all that bad. They both want the same thing, you will find out, but just the means of realizing that is different. And this is something that's been going on and on and on in most of the Studio Ghibli films, where maybe some of the good goes with some of the bad, but it's the thing in between that mostly sticks with us. Let's get back a little bit more in history and talk about the maker of this film, Miyazaki Hayao. He's the director of this film, and this is his second feature film that he did. He did his first feature film in 1979. It was comic, adventurous, kind of like an animation caper from this franchise called Lupin, and that was a nice film, and it got received pretty well in Japan, but it didn't really work for him financially, and it didn't really give him enough of a, of a platform to proceed his work as an animator in the film industry. He was working though in the film industry, but always as like a hired hand in different of the film studios that were in Tokyo, emerging from the Second World War, post-World War, when Japanese animation became a bigger art form than animation became in other countries. So he was meaning to make another film, but it didn't really work out to make one of his own. So after a while he got approached by this magazine called Animage, a Japanese magazine that's been very important in the anime world to not only spot talent but also give them a platform to develop their own ideas. And they said to him, can't you make something for our magazine? Can't you make a manga, which is an anime in reading form? So he figured like, yeah, sure, I can do something, and I want to do something about this Nausicaä character, but then I want to do it on an ad hoc basis whenever I feel like doing it, and I don't want to be restricted in any way whatsoever. So they said, okay, fine, sure. He did that, and over the course of, well, almost decades, he's been working on this manga epic that's also part of the whole film world that you're about to see soon. He was working on that manga, and it got released like periodically, as much of the great literature in the 19th century got released as well. And then after a while, the magazine said, this is really great, why don't you make a film of it? He did that, but the budget was very limited. For Nausicaä, he had to work on a budget that's now like approximately $1 million, and he had to realize the film in the course of, I think, somewhere between 9 and 10 months. Nausicaä, for its age and for its budget and for the short amount of time that this team had to realize this film, looks incredible. What they did is they hired a minor studio somewhere in Tokyo to collaborate with them on making this film, and all the animators of that studio were paid per cell that they drew for the film. So when you drew one cell of the animation, which is like one frame in the thing, you get paid a little bit. So it was like one of the most stressiest freelance jobs ever around that time. And they did a tremendous job, which kind of gave Miyazaki a big boost in his confidence as a filmmaker, because now he faced this enormous challenge of making this film in 10 months, and he realized, I can do this together with my partners. Takahata Isao, who's also a director of Studio Ghibli, who produced this film, and Suzuki Toshio, who is the producer of most of the Studio Ghibli films that would follow. So it's 1984, these three people make this incredible film, and then they figure, we can do this again, we should do this more often. So together, these three people established Studio Ghibli a year later in 1985. And since then, they've been collaborating almost on all of their works. Takahata grew out to be one of the most important Japanese directors as well. His Grave of the Fireflies is one of the most aching and tragic films of the 1990s. Suzuki has been a producer on almost all of those films, and the soundtrack by Joe Hisaishi, who collaborated for the first time on this film from Miyazaki, he grew out to be one of the most frequent collaborators in terms of the music with Miyazaki, and you will hear also soon that this is a very fruitful collaboration. This composer, he was at the time mostly working as this experimental electronic minimal producer, and then he was asked to do this pretty big film score, and there was for him an ideal transition from going to these very specific, more synthesized techniques to composing sweeping orchestral scores that are more in line of film history as we all are used to those film scores. And as you will hear maybe in some of the later Studio Ghibli films, he grew out to be one of the epic composers of Japan as well. So this film in a way is this insane catalyst for all this different talent in Japan to develop their personal vision and then expand that, put it into this feature-length trajectory, and then over the course of that film project it on multiple films. Because if you're seeing Nausicaä, you're kind of seeing a Rosetta Stone of what the rest of the Studio Ghibli films are like. You see themes like this environmental issue, this awesome appreciation of nature that's linked to Shinto religion, that's one of the biggest religions in Japan, and of Buddhist religion. This kind of curiosity and interest and respect for your elders, for nature, for the world around you, for the weather, for the wind, of course, because in all of the Studio Ghibli films, the elements of the weather plays such a huge part. Miyazaki himself, he grew up in a family where his father and his uncle both worked in the aviation industries. His uncle had a company, Miyazaki Company, that developed motors for airplanes. And from a young age onwards, Miyazaki had that interest in aeroplanes. He was actually an avid drawer of aeroplanes and of all these kind of like fantasy flying vehicles. So besides his work as an animator, he was also submitting his drawings to various magazines that featured aviation prints and designs and sketches. And some of his drawings were very realistic, and some of them were way more suitable for a fantasy world. And also in Nausicaä, you can see that because a lot of the kind of like modes of transportation, but also modes of combat that take place in the film are through flying, through aviation. And that's such a vital part of the Ghibli sensation, maybe if you can describe it like that, of seeing such a film, is also being reminded of all of those different elements that are always around us, except for when we're in an air-controlled cinema. By far, this is maybe one of the least iconic Ghibli films because it hasn't been part of like the official Ghibli canon, but at the same time, when you'll see the film, it has all of those same markers. And in the end, what's I think the most interesting, what this film really leaves you with, is this feeling that there's this small world that you get introduced to, and then there's this epic world around it, this universe that the character gets to discover, and you are alone on the ride to discover it with her or him. In this case, it's Nausicaä, who is one of the most awesome and strong female performances that I've seen in a very long time, and that's also a common denominator in a lot of the Studio Ghibli films. The joy of seeing such a film is the same thing as like stepping yourself into in the unlikely shoes of such a protagonist, that you are able to dive into this animated world that is really envisioned from somebody's head, and then everything that you see comes out of somebody's hand drawn. There's this analog feel to it, and there's this sense of discovery while you're joining this adventure of these protagonists. And I hope to all of the people that are here who are seeing maybe a Ghibli for the first time or now seeing Nausicaä to keep going on to this trajectory, because after these films there's so many more to come. And when you'll see a film like Spirited Away or My Neighbor Totoro or Princess Mononoke, all also beautiful films, you will discover that so many of the themes that are in those films are also already here in 1984 on a very small budget, in a very hastily done production schedule, and yet it feels effortless, it feels flawless, it feels like a true piece of art. And now I wish you a beautiful night with Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind. Thank you.